The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1, Titus Groan. The Burning. Although it was Lord Sepulchrave who had summoned the gathering, it was to Sourdust that the party turned when they had all arrived in the library, for his encyclopedic knowledge of ritual gave authority to whatever proceedings were to follow. He stood by the marble table, and as the oldest, and in his opinion the wisest person present, had about him a quite understandable air of his own importance. To wear rich and becoming apparel no doubt engenders a sense of well-being in the wearer, but to be draped, as was Sourdust, in a sacrosanct habit of crimson rags, is to be in a world above such consideration as the price and fit of clothes, and to experience a sense of propriety that no wealth could buy. Sourdust knew that were he to demand it, the wardrobes of Gormenghast would be flung open to him. He did not want it. His mottled beard of alternate black and white hairs was freshly knotted. The crumpled parchment of his ancestral face glimmered in the evening light that swam through the high window. Flay had managed to find 5 chairs, which he placed in a line before the table. Nanny, with Titus on her lap, took up the central position. On her right, Lord Sepulchrave, and on her left the Countess Gertrude, sat in attitudes peculiar to them, the former with his right elbow on the arm of the chair and his chin lost in the palm of his hand, and the Countess obliterating the furniture she sat in. On her right sat the doctor, his long legs crossed, and a footling smile of anticipation on his face. At the other end of the row his sister sat with her pelvis at least a foot to the rear of an excited perpendicular, her thorax, neck, and head. Fuchsia, for whom, much to her relief, no chair was to be found, stood behind them, her hands behind her back. Between her fingers a small green handkerchief was being twisted round and round. She watched the ancient Sourdust take a step forward and wondered what it must feel like to be so old and wrinkled. "I wonder if I'll be as old as that," she thought. "An old wrinkled woman, older than my mother, older than Nanny Slagg even." She gazed at the black mass of her mother's back. "Who is there anyway who isn't old? There isn't anybody. Only that boy who hasn't any lineage. I wouldn't mind much, but he's different from me and too clever for me, and even he's not young, not like I'd like my friends to be." Her eyes moved along the line of heads, one after the other, old heads that didn't understand. Her eyes rested at last on Irma. "She hasn't any lineage either," said Fuchsia to herself. "And her neck is much too clean, and it's the longest and thinnest and funniest I've ever seen. I wonder if she's really a white giraffe all the time and pretending she isn't." Fuchsia's mind flew to the stuffed giraffe's neck in the attic. "Perhaps it belongs to her," she thought. And the idea so appealed to Fuchsia that she lost control of herself and spluttered. Sourdust, who was about to begin and had raised his old hand for the purpose, started and peered across at her. Mrs. Slagg clutched Titus a little tighter and listened very hard for anything further. Lord Sepulchrave did not move his body an inch, but opened one eye slowly. Lady Gertrude, as though Fuchsia's splutter had been a signal, shouted to Flay, who was behind the library door. "Open the door and let that bird in! What are you waiting for, man?" Then she whistled with a peculiar ventriloquism, and a wood warbler sped, undulating through the long, dark hollow of library air, to land on her finger. Irma simply twitched, but was too refined to look round, and it was left to the doctor to make contact with Fuchsia by means of an exquisitely timed wink with his left eye behind his convex lens, like an oyster, shutting and opening itself beneath a pool of water. Sourdust, disturbed by this unseemly interjection, and also by the presence of the wood warbler, which kept distracting his eye by running up and down Lady Gertrude's arm, lifted his head again, fingering a running bowline in his beard. His hoarse and quavering voice wandered through the library like something lost. The long shelves surrounded them, tier upon tier, circumscribing their world with a wall of other worlds, imprisoned, yet breathing among the network of 1,000,000 commas, semicolons, full stops, hyphens, and every other sort of printed symbol.
"We are gathered together," said Sourdust, "in this ancient library, in the instigation of Sepulchrave, 76th Earl to the House of Gormenghast, and lord of those tracts of country that stretch on every hand, in the north to the wasteland, in the south to the grey salt marshes, and in the east to the quick sands and the tideless sea, and in the west to knuckles of endless rock."
This was delivered in one weak, monotonous stream. Sourdust coughed for some time and then, regaining his breath, continued mechanically.
"We are gathered on this 17th day of October to give ear to his lordship. Yes, these nights the moon is in the ascendant, and the river is full of fish. The owls in the tower of flints seek their prey as heretofore, and it is appropriate that his lordship should, on the 17th day of an autumn month, bring forward the matter that is in his mind. The sacred duties which he has never wavered to perform are over for the hour. It is appropriate that it should be now, at the 6th hour of the daylight clock. I, as master of ritual, as guardian of the documents, and as confidant to the family, am able to say that for his lordship to speak to you in no way contravenes the tenets of Gormenghast. But your lordship and your revered ladyship, said Sourdust in his old sing-song, it is no secret to those here gathered that it is towards the child, who now occupies pride of place. It is towards Lord Titus that our thoughts will converge this afternoon. That is no secret.
Sourdust gave vent to a dreadful chesty cough.
It is to Lord Titus, he said, gazing mistily at the child, and then raising his voice. It is to Lord Titus, he repeated irritably.
Nanny suddenly realized that the old man was making signs at her, and understood that she was to lift the infant up in the air as though he were a specimen or something to be auctioned. She lifted him, but no one looked at the exhibit, except Prunsquallor, who nearly engulfed Nanny, baby, and all with a smile so devouring, so dental, as to cause Nanny to raise her shoulder against it and to snatch Titus back to her little flat chest.
Yes, I will turn my back on you and strike the table 4 times, said Sourdust. Slagg will bring a child to the table, and Lord Sepulchrave will...
Here he suffered a more violent fit of coughing than ever, and at the same moment Irma's neck quivered a little, and she in her own way followed suit with 5 little ladylike barks. She turned her head apologetically in the direction of the Countess and wrinkled her forehead in self-depreciation. She could see that the Countess had taken no notice of her mute apology. She arched her nostrils. It had not crossed her mind that there was a smell in the room other than the prevalent smell of musty leather. It was just that her nostrils, with their hypersensitive nerve endings, were acting on their own accord. Sourdust took some time to recover from his bout, but eventually he straightened himself and repeated,
Slagg will bring the child to the table, and Lord Sepulchrave will graciously advance, following his menial. And on arriving at a point immediately behind me, will touch the back of my neck with the forefinger of his left hand. At the signal, I and Slagg will retire, and Slagg, having left the infant on the table, Lord Sepulchrave will pass behind the table and stand facing us across its surface. Are you hungry, my little love? Is there no grain inside you? Is that it? Is that it?
The voice came forth so suddenly and heavily and so closely upon the quavering accents of Sourdust that everyone felt for the first few moments that the remark was addressed to them personally. But on turning their heads they could see that the Countess was addressing herself exclusively to the wood warbler. Whether the warbler made any reply was never ascertained, for not only was Irma seized with a new and less ladylike bout of short dry coughs, but her brother and Nanny Slagg, joining her, filled the room with noise. The bird rose in the air, startled, and Lord Sepulchrave stopped on his passage to the table and turned irritably to the line of noisy figures. But as he did so, a faint smell of smoke, making itself perceptible for the first time, caused him to raise his head and sniff the air in a slow, melancholy way. At the same time, Fuchsia felt a roughness in her throat. She glanced about the room and wrinkled her nose, for smoke, though still visible, was infiltrating steadily through the library. Prunsquallor had risen from beside the Countess, and with his white hands wound about each other and with his mouth twisted into a quizzical line, he permitted his eyes to move rapidly around the room. His head was cocked to one side. "What's the matter, man?" asked the Countess heavily from immediately below him. She was still seated. "The matter?" queried the doctor, smiling more emphatically, but still keeping his eyes on the move. "It is a case of atmosphere, as far as I can dare to judge at such very, very short notice, your ladyship. As far as I dare to judge, it is a case of thickening atmosphere." "Smoke?" said the Countess, heavily and bluntly. "What is the matter with smoke? Haven't you ever smelt it before?" "Many and many a time, your ladyship," answered the doctor. "But never, if I may say so, never in here." The Countess grunted to herself and settled deeper into the chair. "There never is smoke in here," said Lord Sepulchrave. He turned his head to the door and raised his voice a little. "Flay!" The long servant emerged out of the shadows like a spider. "Open the door," said Lord Sepulchrave sharply, and as the spider turned and began its return journey, his lordship took a step towards old Sourdust, who was by now doubled over the table in a paroxysm of coughing. His lordship, taking one of Sourdust's elbows, beckoned to Fuchsia, who came across the room and supported the old man on the other side, and the three of them began to make their way to the door in Flay's wake. Lady Groan simply sat like a mountain and watched the little bird. Dr. Prunsquallor was wiping his eyes, his thick glasses pushed for the moment above his eyebrows, but he was very much on the alert, and as soon as his spectacles were again in place, he grinned at everyone in turn. His eyes lingered for a moment on his sister Irma, who was systematically tearing an expensively embroidered cream-coloured silk handkerchief into small pieces. Behind the dark lenses of her glasses, the eyes were hidden from view, but to judge from the thin, wet, drooping line of her mouth and the twitching of the skin on her pointed nose, it might be safely assumed that they were making contact with and covering the inner side of the lenses of her spectacles with the moisture with which the smoke had filmed them. The doctor placed the tips of his fingers and thumbs together, and then, separating the tapering extremities of the index fingers, he watched them for a few seconds as they gyrated around one another. Then his eyes turned to the far end of the room where he could see the Earl and his daughter, with the old man between them, approaching the library door. Someone presumably Flay, seemed to be making a great deal of noise in wrestling with the heavy iron door handle. The smoke was spreading, and the doctor, wondering why in the devil's name the door had not been thrown open, began to peer about the room in an effort to locate the source of the ever-thickening wreaths. As he took a step past Nanny Slagg, he saw that she was standing by the table from whose marble surface she had plucked Titus. She was holding him very close to herself and had wrapped him in layers of cloth which had completely hidden him from view. A sound of muffled crying could be heard from the bundle. Nanny's little wrinkled mouth was hanging open. Her streaming eyes were redder than usual with the stinging smoke, but she stood quite still. "My very dear good woman," said Dr. Prunsquallor, turning on his heel as he was about to float past her. "My very dear Slagg, convey his minute lordship to the door that for some reason that is too subtle for me to appreciate remains shut. Why, in the name of ventilation, I don't know, but it does. It remains shut. Take him nevertheless, my dear Slagg, to the aforesaid door, and place his infinitesimal head at the keyhole. Surely that's still open, and even if you cannot squeeze the child right through it, you can at least give his lordship's lungs something to get on with." Nanny Slagg was never very good at interpreting the doctor's long sentences, especially when coming through a haze of smoke, and all that she could gather was that she should attempt to squeeze her tiny lordship through the keyhole. Clutching the baby even tighter in her thin arms, "No, no, no!" she cried, retreating from the doctor. Dr. Prunsquallor rolled his eyes at the Countess. She was apparently aware of the state of the room at last, and was gathering together great swathes of drapery in a slow, deliberate manner, preparatory to rising to her feet. The rattling at the library door became more violent, but the indigenous shadows and the smoke combined to make it impossible to see what was going on. "Slagg," said the doctor, advancing on her, "go to the door immediately, like the intelligent woman you are." "No, no!" shrieked the midget in so silly a voice that Dr. Prunsquallor, after taking a handkerchief from his pocket, lifted her from her feet and tucked her under his arm. The handkerchief enveloping Nanny Slagg's waist prevented the nurse's garments from coming into contact with the doctor's clothes. Her legs, like black twigs blown in the wind, gesticulated for a few moments and then were still. Before they had reached the door, however, they were met by Lord Sepulchrave, who emerged darkly from the smoke.
"The door has been locked from the outside,"
he whispered between fits of coughing. "Locked?" queried Prunsquallor. "Locked, your lordship? By all that's perfidious, this is becoming intriguing, most intriguing, perhaps a bit too intriguing. What do you think, Fuchsia, my dear little lady, eh? Well, well, we must become positively cerebral, mustn't we? By all that's enlightened, we really must. Can it be smashed?" He turned to Lord Sepulchrave. "Can we breach it, your lordship? Battery and assault and all that delicious sort of thing?"
"Too thick, Prunsquallor," said Lord Sepulchrave. 4-inch oak."
He spoke slowly, in strange contrast to Prunsquallor's rapid, ejaculatory chirping. Sourdust had been propped near the door, where he sat coughing as though to shake his old body to bits.
"No key for the other door," continued Lord Sepulchrave slowly. "It is never used. What about the window?"
For the first time a look of alarm appeared on his ascetic face. He walked quickly to the nearest bookshelves and ran his fingers along the spines of calf. Then he turned with a quickness unusual for him.
"Where is the smoke thickest?"
"I've been searching for its origin, your lordship,"
came Prunsquallor's voice out of the haze.
"It's everywhere so thick that it's very difficult to say. By all the pits of darkness, it most damnably is. But I'm looking, I'm looking."
He trilled for a moment like a bird. Then his voice came again.
"Fuchsia, dear," he shouted. "Are you all right?"
"Yes." Fuchsia had to swallow hard before she could shout back, for she was very frightened. "Yes, Dr. Prune."
"Slagg?"
shouted the doctor.
Keep Titus near the keyhole. See that she does, Fuchsia."
"Yes," whispered Fuchsia, and went in search of Mrs. Slagg. It was just then that an uncontrolled scream ran through the room. Irma, who had been tearing her cream-coloured handkerchief, now found that she had ripped it into such minute particles that with nothing left to tear, and with her hands in forced idleness, she could control herself no longer. Her knuckles had tried to stifle the cry, but her terror had grown too strong for such expedients, and at the final moment she forgot all she had learnt about decorum and about how to be a lady, and clenching her hands at her thighs she had stood on tiptoe and screamed from her swan-like throat with an effect calculated to freeze the blood of a macaw.